So firstly, you are going to hear from Heather Elgar, who is the External Affairs Officer for the Woodland Trust in the Southwest. And she'll be followed by Kate Tobin, who is the Local Partnership Advisor for the Forestry Commission in the Southwest. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our experts.
Great, thanks all. Thanks, Ellie. So good afternoon, everyone. Great to have so many of you on the call today. I'm really excited to have this discussion with you this afternoon about woodland creation in Devon. So that's a really great intro from Ellie. You know, there's been so much talk about woodland creation or tree planting over the last, the last year or so. So much that we need to do together to make that happen. So deliberately presenting alongside Kate from the Forestry Commission today, because we feel like it's helpful, hopefully, to present our perspectives and our available support together. So whether you're maybe you've got a tree planting scheme in mind, maybe you're looking at sort of a community collaboration for getting trees in the ground, maybe you're working on that sort of strategic join up across Devon, maybe you're just interested to learn, but hopefully we'll give you some ideas today on how we get more trees in the ground in an appropriate way. So first, I think Ellie's going to release a couple of polls. This is just to get a sense, it's just helpful to get a sense of who we've got on the call in terms of the scope of your interest. So whether, you've got some land that you're interested in planting and what size that is, or maybe you're an interested citizen, maybe, as I mentioned earlier, you're looking at a kind of a wider Devon-wide view. So I'll just let that run for a little bit. Oh, that's instant, that's nice. So we get sort of a bit of a picture. Okay, very, very mixed then. So I think I'll, while that runs, I'll just quickly say a little bit about the Woodland Trust for those who don't know us. So we are the largest woodland woodland conservation charity in the UK. So we protect, restore, create trees and woods on our own sites, but also through others. We also have a sort of policy campaigning research arm. And we do a lot of our work in partnership. So the polls are now in, so I'll share the results. Very mixed. It's really good to see. So we've got a really good mix of interests on the group. That's fantastic. So you're all very relevant. We need scales. We need efforts at all those scales. So that's great that we've got such a wide range. Great. So just to reflect on what a fascinating couple of years and moment of time we're in, right? So obviously we've seen, the last couple of years, everyone's been declaring climate emergencies. We've seen, a huge surge in public political interest in tree planting, in trees. So there's a lot of interest in that, which is great. Obviously we've had the pandemic too, which has been very hard for many. It's also taught us a lot of lessons, one of which I think is that just the importance of access to nature for our health and well-being. Been all sorts of polls and studies that have happened during the pandemic. And I think what's also really interesting is that survey after survey show that the UK public still think that the green action is the priority despite the pandemic context. So we're definitely at a really interesting time, and I think despite the pandemic, there's so many of us on the call today, so that interest in trees has not waned at all. And I think just to say a few words about trees and the climate emergency, because that's really the sort of driver for a lot of interest in tree planting. So obviously that's a lot of that is around the carbon storage capability, if you like, of trees, but it's also, there's so many wider benefits than just that. So I think if we're starting from, when we work with nature, really ensure that there's a healthy natural environment, that there's a whole myriad of benefits, wider benefits, everything from carbon and air quality, flood control, through to our health and well-being. So we've really got to keep an eye on all these multiple benefits when we're thinking about what trees can do for us. So in terms of the climate emergency, trees absolutely help mitigate and also in terms of our adaptation to the climate emergency. A few more words on carbon. No one's pretending we can plant our way out of climate change. This is a pretty bit of basic curve here. So if you imagine that this is a decarbonisation plan for somewhere, we still need all of those technological behavioural solutions that we are and maybe aren't talking about. Tree planting is absolutely not to replace any of that urgent effort. You know, the idea of woodland creation is about how do we offset those residual emissions at the end of that. So we do need all of these different aspects in our climate emergency response. The Committee on Climate Change, which advises government, they're talking a lot more about you know, integrated land use, and this sort of the target that they're recommending for woodland creation in the UK is at least 17, ideally 19% canopy cover. And again, it's looking at wider land use as well. So that gives you a bit of context of the climate drivers there. Bit more on carbon. The key thing I want you to take from this image is that the where the carbon goes. A lot more carbon, a lot of the carbon sequestered by a tree is actually stored in the soil, which is only we're learning more and more about this all the time, but recent studies show that up to 75%. So that has big implications for how we're, you know, managing soils and disturbing soils as well, on whatever level that we're, you know, working at. I also just wanted to highlight this table. This is an evidence review from Natural England about the different carbon storage rates of different habitat types. I don't want you to get too fixated on these numbers because there are lots of different studies around these things, but the key thing I want you to take from this is that it's not just about woodlands. You know, a healthy natural environment in many of its habitat types, you know, they're all really important in our climate emergency response. The other, I guess, word of warning, if you like, with this table, which is widely used and it's really helpful as a proxy, is that this study only goes down to about 15 centimetres. So again, often these numbers are underestimated when you're looking at, again, the soil. The carbon in the soil is absolutely key. So talked about the climate emergency, but it's really not just about the climate emergency, and I don't say that to undermine it. This is, I think this is a really helpful graphic. This is from the Stockholm Resilience Centre, and they've developed a 9 planetary boundaries framework, which shows that yes, we've overshot climate change, but there are many others. So we really need to, you know, our response to this wider planetary boundary crisis, if you like, we really need to have an integrated response to biodiversity crisis, our land use, you know, pollutions and nutrient cycles. We need to respond to all of this in a really integrated way. It's really important. Another way of framing this, maybe you've seen this on the social media rounds. It's quite an interesting graphic that shows, again, yes, we've got the climate response is still key, but we do have this much wider, well, we have this integrated, wider, potentially biodiversity crisis. I won't depress you, bore you with the statistics. It's pretty hard to avoid these in the media these days. There are lots of really harrowing stories about the scale of biodiversity loss. And ecological breakdown. I think sometimes when we're in, you know, beautiful leafy Devon, we forget how much nature has declined even in Devon. Yeah, nature is in trouble, and we need to work together on nature recovery. So if that's a bit of the context, how do we act on nature recovery, and where does tree planting or woodland creation fit in that? There's this idea of a nature recovery network that governments sort of set out, and they're developing this nationally, and work is underway as we speak to develop this in Devon. And what this means is basically coming up with a much smarter spatial plan, if you like, for nature recovery. So it's looking at, instead of having sort of fragmented sites for nature, be it a wetland, be it a woodland, it's really looking at how we best try and connect all those, you know, make those spaces for nature bigger, make them better quality, have more of them, and join them up. And this is, yes, there's a lot of work around trying to map this. This will have huge implications for, or will really help us steer woodland creation efforts, because obviously woodland creation can help make all of these networks more resilient by making them bigger, and looking at those corridors and things like the role of hedgerows become really important there. But that work will also show us, when we're looking at woodlands alongside, you know, species-rich grasslands and peatlands and wetlands, it will help us really understand where we shouldn't plant as well. and where we need sort of more sort of dynamic mosaics of habitat. That's maybe where this rewilding concept comes in a bit more as well. So that's one perspective that's really important. As I say, it's happening at the Devon level. So that's underway through the Nature Partnership. There are lots of lessons as well from this sort of thinking on a farm level as well. So perhaps you have a little copse of woodland that, you know, if you're thinking of creating more woodland, expanding that is really, can be really important. Again, the connectivity with hedgerows is really powerful. Another really helpful perspective when we're looking at the ecological crisis is working with, you know, thinking about water catchment management. And again, yeah, it's really about working at scale with nature to restore those natural processes. So again, just looking at where trees fall on this map when we're looking at good water management, whether it's water quality, quantity, you know, woodlands can help catch away some of the water from help with flood management. You know, riparian planting, so trees alongside river corridors not only strengthens that as an ecological corridor, can also help reduce soil erosion, and a lot of this is about helping to slow the flow. So again, through this catchment management perspective, and there are, I think, 4 catchment partnerships in Devon, we can signpost you to those as well. So there's work underway to strategically identify where the best opportunities are for trees and other habitat types to help this best water management. I think we might have heard that of the story of beavers as well. There's been a beaver trial and they've got their right to remain. So again, the role of beavers is really helpful in providing some of these leaky barriers. So I think as 2 kind of key concepts to hold when you're thinking about where do trees fit in this sort of ecological emergency, I think this nature recovery network and water catchment perspectives are 2 really helpful things to think alongside each other. And again, when we're looking at the scale of the climate, the sort of ecological crisis, and you're possibly wondering where rewilding comes in and our sort of views on that. I think rewilding, lots of people mean slightly different things when they're using that term. So what we'd say is we're absolutely supportive, 100% of working with nature to restore these dynamic natural processes at scale. So we're really interested in projects which are looking at, you know, natural regeneration where it's appropriate, where there's a sufficient seed stock, and that's about developing that genetic diversity as well among those species, but really trying to have those dynamic mosaics. So yeah, trees as part of wider grazing systems, and where there might be some ponds as well. So that's a really exciting vision for us, and that works. That's relevant, appropriate certainly in some areas, not everywhere, granted, but we're really excited about that sort of vision. Again, I think just thinking about where your remit is, whether you're thinking on a farm level or you know, as an individual, or on a wider level, I've sort of mentioned, I think it's helpful to think of these different scales. So I've talked about nature recovery networks, the catchment approach, which is sort of looking at maximising, if you like, these benefits of woodlands at that kind of strategic level. Again, if you're thinking maybe on, you know, on a parish level or in a town, trees have many benefits as well in terms of making our towns better for people, helping with flood protection and so on. But the main reason to put this slide up is just so we don't forget our global footprint and all of this as well. I think Kate might mention a bit about markets later, but there's no point in us you know, realizing a Devonian pristine rainforest if our actions to get there you know, result in Amazonian destruction, for example. So our decisions as consumers really matter, and let's not forget the importance of that. So yeah, so clearly there are lots of multiple benefits, if you like, to different types of woodland creation. And I think just to so the final point on this carbon piece, I suppose, from our perspective, is, you know, perhaps what's the right KPI, what's the right measurement of success, how should we be driving our woodland creation? Again, because there's a lot of focus on the climate emergency response. This is just some modelling we did in the Northern Forest. We 50 million trees, where would they go if we're trying to maximise that carbon? And that looks quite different to yeah, where we plant those same trees if we were trying to maximize all those benefits to nature, to wildlife, to water, to people. These are not scale, that's just to give you a sense of that it's just pictorial representation. And I think so I think the answer to what's the right KPI in terms of are we I'm deliberately not talking about which tree species maximize carbon storage, because I think that's the wrong question. I think it's more about yeah, we've got to focus on the right tree in the right place, you know, making sure that we've got those resilient woodlands for nature recovery, for productive forestry as well, for community woodlands. There's a whole range of woodlands with different benefits. All trees will capture carbon, but there's a little bit of a risk if we're just chasing that. Obviously, individual landowners will respond, are making their own management decisions, so that's fine, and Kate will come to that later. But on that wider view, that's quite an important nuance. I'll also just briefly mention climate resilience. It's really important, so it shouldn't be brief. Kate will come to it as well a little bit later. So great, trees help us be resilient and respond to the climate emergency. We've also got to ensure that our woodlands are resilient, obviously in the face of a changing climate as well. There is discussion about, should we be planting more southerly species? Again, our view as the Woodland Trust is that when, and there is evidence behind this, if biodiversity is the primary objective in a woodland creation scheme, then we believe, looking at the evidence, that there's enough genetic diversity in our native species so that we don't need to introduce those new species. If you're talking about urban planting or productive forestry, then that's maybe a different question. But if we're responding to the biodiversity and climate crises together, we really need to ensure that we've got really resilient, well-connected native trees and woods. So how much should we be going for? So we've our policy paper on this, so our emergency tree plan, we launched this earlier in the year, and this sort of sets out our approach for how we can respond to the nature and climate emergencies together. We believe we need 19%. That's building on the Committee on Climate Change sort of higher recommended level. Really important that whatever percentage we're going for, it's an annual target, so it needs to be a sustainable delivery, and we need to be ensuring we're building in age diversity into our woodlands as well. And what does that mean for Devon? What does that mean for your patch of land maybe in Devon? This clearly needs to be localised, and I mentioned earlier that there is work underway through the Devon Local Nature Partnership to map out a nature recovery network, so that will help identify what really is appropriate in Devon, and that is underway. But as a starting point, we'd say that there probably is space when we're looking at, it's not just one contiguous massive woodland, it's trees and woods in there, many forms. So we've got, big woodlands, we've got the hedgerows, we've got the trees outside woods, and the importance as well of there is space for natural regeneration, direct seeding, planting, and mixes thereof as well as appropriate. So just to give you a bit of a map, so again, just to emphasize, there are many forms of woodland to get us to that 19% or whatever is appropriate. So as I said before, we're really excited about these sort of more rewilding type of projects, the role of woodlands in good catchment management, in really connecting, creating strong, healthy, resilient nature recovery networks. I haven't said much yet about trees on farms. So I mentioned hedgerows earlier. Agroforestry is a really interesting area that's there's a lot of science studies underway at the moment around agroforestry, and that's really understanding where integrating more trees on farms and actually breaking down this agriculture forestry slightly false historic divide as well. Introducing trees on farms can actually help with your yield when you're looking at, and the long-term sustainability of a farm when you're looking at good soil management, etc. Shade for livestock, potentially diversification with new crops and so on. So there's a really good handbook actually if you're interested in that area, called the Agroforestry Handbook, and lots of other kind of links and things around that. And again, maybe you're interested in this sort of town, parish level, looking at the benefits of individual trees. So hopefully you can see whatever interests you have. Hopefully you can see yourself in this picture. There's room for yeah, a whole range of trees and woods, obviously productive forestry as well. If I didn't, that's an obvious one if I didn't mention. I should say as well, if we're going for 19% or whatever is appropriate, it's not just about creating new woods. We have to protect and better manage what we've already got. So I won't say more on that, we just mustn't forget that. Some other key considerations towards 19% or whatever is appropriate. Ash dieback is sadly truly with us. So it's likely to take maybe 80 to 95% of our ash in the UK. Ash is one of our most common trees, so it will devastate our treescapes. So when we're looking towards a bold target like that, we really need to understand that that will go down before it goes up again. We need to be responding to ash. So there, as Ellie mentioned at the beginning, there will be a separate talk next week, I think, about ash dieback. So if you're interested in learning more about that, maybe you've got ash dieback on your own land, want to understand the support available, really recommend you listen to that talk. There's a project called Saving Devon's Treescape, which is providing advice, support to farmers and helping provide replacement trees as well. But the lesson, one of the many lessons from that experience, when we're again thinking about towards whatever number is appropriate for Devon, we need to think about where are the trees coming from. So again, I mentioned earlier the importance of sort of annual targets. If we suddenly, not that it's feasible anyway, but if we suddenly planted all of this tomorrow, we'd be flooded with, the markets would be flooded. There's a real danger of importing new disease. So that's it's really important that we don't do that. So some sort of suggestions, perspectives from our view. First, the importance again of natural regeneration where it's appropriate. That's really promoting, encouraging that genetic diversity anyway on our native trees, and avoids the need to plant, or can be supported by planting. All the trees that we provide as the Woodland Trust are UK and Ireland sourced and grown. That's kind of a certified scheme. Otherwise, there's lots of work underway nationally around developing stronger biosecurity standards. But again, if you're thinking about a tree woodland creation project of your own, just a real nod to think about where you're getting those trees from. Are your nurseries following sound biosecurity measures? Can you support your local nurseries? Maybe you're interested in setting up a nursery. So these are really important things to think about. I think Kate's going to talk about mammal damage in more detail, but I'll just put it there. It's really important and we've got to think about it, and that has implications as well for, I know there's a lot of concern about using plastics in woodland creation projects. We can maybe pick that up later. But we do need to protect trees from, new trees from squirrel and deer damage in particular. So where we can, if we can use fencing to avoid plastic, that's great. There's a need for wider kind of strategic projects to address some of these issues. You might be aware of pine marten reintroductions. That's one way of trying to control squirrel populations as well. So those are some of the many aspects to think about. And I think just, going back to when you were saying sort of where you are, what your remit is, just to say that to get to 19% in Devon or whatever we're going for, that there are so many roles in making that happen. So maybe you're a landowner, maybe you're a business, maybe you can support in the fundraising, maybe you're a policymaker in a local authority, maybe you've got the time to volunteer and support, maybe you can provide, you're involved in nursery or provision of trees. So there's a lot of, there are many roles out there, campaigning as well around this, helping match make this. Just to briefly run through some of our schemes, support schemes, and the Forestry Commission ones are sort of larger, so think of these as the smaller ones. So our large-scale woodland creation schemes, we have more woods and more hedges schemes, where we'll basically contribute up to 75% of the costs if you plant where you've got over half a hectare. And then we've also got community tree packs, which are free trees for schools and community groups where it becomes a publicly open space. which, yeah, if you're interested in applying for one of these packs, you can apply to be delivered in March next year. Again, that's a great way of getting wider community involved. Of course, when we're talking about the importance of protecting, creating, enhancing all of those aspects to get to that 19%, there are many things you can do beyond getting trees in the ground. Just some thoughts to signpost you to. You might be aware that the England Tree Strategy is currently under consultation. That's a government new strategy. So if you're interested and you haven't yet seen that or responded, that's over soon. The deadline is Friday, so that will very much set out government's approach to woodland creation. So that's important. Some other kind of more local things you might be interested in is there's something called the Tree Charter, which is a sort of a renewal of the ancient Forest Charter, and it really sets out a vision for society that works, if you like, with trees. And there are a number of charter branches actually across Devon. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, maybe look online. There might be a group you might be interested in joining. Yeah, lots of volunteering opportunities as well. Lots of opportunities beyond that. Those are just some ideas. Gosh, I'm aware of time. I was just going to quickly mention as well, these are smaller scale, but just some ideas of some sort of community examples of woodland creation, tree planting. One is in Bristol. This is an initiative responding to the city's ambition to double canopy cover. And this was a campaign last year that was basically unlocking business support. So there was a campaign, it was sort of donate £10 per employee sort of thing. That was the scheme. That was quite a simple way actually of getting quite a lot of new funding basically from businesses to support that sort of citywide approach. So that's quite interesting. One in Frome quite recently. So again, this is just a town council acting. So they've developed a strategy. They've got a tree policy, and they've did some quite nice tree planting initiatives this year. So again, it doesn't all have to happen at the Devon level. There's a lot you can do on the community level. This was another nice project in Bristol again, where the community got together with a hospital, planted on hospital land, and that's very much about those sort of well-being benefits as well, involving the schools and things. So I'll stop there, and I'm aware for time, so I'll hand over to Kate now, but hopefully that gives you some thoughts.
So whilst Kate is just getting her presentation up and running, thank you very much for the questions that have come in so far into the chat box, and also for the interaction and for responding to each other's questions. That's really, really useful. I've also, as Heather's been talking, been popping some of the links she's been referring to into there. So if you're interested in following any of that up, that is the place to go. But I will stop talking and let Kate take over.
Hi, thank you very much. Thanks, Heather, and thanks, Eleanor. My name's Kate Tobin. I'm the local partnership advisor for the Southwest for the Forestry Commission, and I work with people on privately and publicly owned land. I don't work on the Forestry Commission public forest estate. That's a sort of separate area of the business, Forestry England. So I work more on the grants and regulations and policy and advice. So moving on, Heather was talking about the main policy drivers. At the moment, we've got the 25-year environment plan with the environment bill going through and due to be enacted in 2021. Which commits to nature recovery networks throughout England. And we've also recently had the planning white paper come out, which some of you may have seen, which talks about dividing areas into areas for protect, for growth, and for renewal. And a key part of those areas that will be protected will be based around local nature recovery strategies, which local authorities will be broadly will be in charge of, as it were. Lots and lots of people working together to try and draw those together. So that's a really important piece of work that's going on at the moment. There are other strategies like the Clean Air Strategy and the Tree Health Resilience ones that are very much focused around woodlands and forestry. And at the moment we have the England Tree Strategy, which is out for consultation, and the deadline for that is on Friday. So if you'd like to sort of have your say about trees and woodlands in England, it's a really important consultation. Do please have a look at the link, which I think Ellie will either has shared or will be sharing shortly, and do get involved in commenting on the England Tree Strategy. And I thought I'd also mention at this stage, but in a little bit more detail later, the UK Forestry Standard, which is our sort of, which is the kind of the best practice that or grant applications or felling licenses or management plans should adhere to, that new woodlands should be designed in accordance with the UK Forestry Standard. It's a really important sort of baseline of good practice, which all foresters work to, and which, you know, everybody in the sort of woodland world should be aware of. So yeah, I'm sure you'll remember during the election that trees were a bit of a sort of a political hot potato, with lots and lots of different figures being bandied about. The current government aspiration is for 30,000 hectares per year to be planted in the UK. That's not a target we're meeting at the moment. More is being planted in Scotland than in England. In England, the figures are very low. I think 1,248 hectares last year. So there's a huge, huge step change needed. And we do have the beginnings of that with the England tree planting programme, which is getting into place, and the budget, the nature climate budget, which has been agreed this year, so which will put significantly more investment into woodland creation. And a lot of people feel that England is already quite a well-wooded country, but actually when you look at the comparison with Europe, it really isn't. Much of Europe is sort of up in the 30s in terms of the percentage of woodland cover, and the further north you go, Sweden, 68%, we've really got quite low woodland cover historically, and it was much lower actually, and the Forestry Commission was sort of a real turning point in that. And I thought, just to give it a little bit of Southwest context, this is just the figures for the AONBs, the areas of outstanding natural beauty in the Southwest, which gives you a bit of an idea of the levels of woodland cover that we have. With the Quantock Hills, I didn't realise it was this high actually, coming up as 27%. And then obviously the Isles of Scilly, not very many, but then Cornwall down at around 8% in terms of woodland cover, although when you take in the trees and hedgerows and infield trees, it may be a bit higher than that. And if you wonder what that looks like, I thought I'd just put up some images of some of those landscapes, just so that you could see that if we were to achieve 17 to 19%, actually those aren't scary landscapes. Those are landscapes that we're really quite used to and quite comfortable with, and where rural land uses of all sorts continue. So I thought I'd just share that. I'll just take a glass of water. So I think lots of people are used to the sort of the mantra, the phrase, the right tree in the right place, which is something that we all agree with. But the more that we discuss these things, the more actually I felt it was quite useful on this, in this talk, to talk about the right tree in the right place for the right reason and in the right way, because there's an awful lot to discuss about woodland creation and tree planting. I won't go into detail over the reasons, because I think Heather set out a lot of those very clearly. I would just say that we also very much focus on the fact that carbon sequestration, the use of timber and the use of wood products, is incredibly important for increasing carbon, for storing carbon. So once we've grown those trees, if we can actually create houses and we store that carbon for decades and sometimes centuries more, that's a really good thing. So we need to think about construction and the end use of timber as well, and make sure that that's part of the discussion when we talk about carbon sequestration. And we will support both, obviously, for that reason. And the ecological emergency, yes, definitely. We've talked about that in great detail. We work very closely. I should have said at the beginning, actually, Forestry Commission is part of DEFRA. We work alongside Natural England and the EA, and we're all part of DEFRA. And we're working very closely on the nature recovery networks and the local nature recovery strategies. So that's an area that we're fully supportive of, and there's some really interesting natural solutions coming forward. I thought I'd talk a little bit more about the green recovery aspect, to the right reason for planting. And I think it's just worth seeing it in sort of context, that we know that it's really important to have food security. And currently we have about 61% food security, self-sustaining in food. And that really varies between different food types, which is the reason why the figure is where it is. When you look at timber security, we're importing about 82% of our timber needs. And these are essential things. These aren't non-essentials. They're things that we really need for construction, pallets, loo roll, packaging. Coronavirus really taught us that pallets and packaging and the use of timber for that was extremely important. So we shouldn't forget that actually it's very important that we build up our forest industry, and that we do try and make ourselves as self-sustaining in timber and wood products as we can, and therefore that we do consider that alongside all the other reasons for planting trees. Just some very brief slides. I won't dwell on them at the moment because we've got an awful lot to go through, but just to sort of highlight that forestry is a market that has been growing. It's really important that we do sort of support that, and that we make the most of it. It's a really good sustainable rural land use, so we need to kind of encourage it as much as we can. And it's not just softwoods. The last graph was predominantly about softwoods, but also hardwoods. There's real demand for hardwoods. The big problem with hardwoods is the impact that grey squirrels have, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. The demand is there. If we can grow it, and if we can process it, and if we can support that industry, then it provides all the more reasons for getting trees in the ground. In terms of the right way to plant them, we're having loads of discussions about that with loads of different people. And one of the big discussions is about, do you plant, or do you sit back and allow nature to take its course? And there are pros and cons to both. And I'm not, again, going to go into a huge amount of detail at the moment, but just briefly to say that with planting, actually, I'll start with natural colonization. It tends to be called, sometimes people call it rewilding, sometimes natural regeneration. Generally, natural regeneration is what happens in the forest, and natural colonization is what happens outside the forest. Sorry, I'll go back one there. So if you allow the natural colonization to occur, that's great. If you've got a good seed source nearby, so say, for example, if it's near an ancient woodland and you want to expand the area of the ancient woodland, and you've got good seed sources and good prevailing wind and suitable soils, etc., then yes, it can be a really good way to do it. It creates great edge habitat as it develops, and you can get local species, indigenous local species predominating in there. However, if you don't have decent seed sources, if you actually got, for example, you may just get huge amounts of birch or sycamore coming in, and you may not want that to happen. It can take longer to establish. There are various sort of cons to it as well. When you look at planting, some of the big pros, your trees will get away faster. You can select the species you want. The carbon sequestration, because the trees are growing quicker, and you may actually be selecting for that reason, you may be able to achieve carbon sequestration more quickly than you would do through natural colonization, if that's one of your motivating factors. And selecting the species you want, if you're doing it for income, then that's going to be really important to you. It can be more expensive to get it started. You're going to need to protect either sort of route. You're going to need to protect from deer, and you do have more ground disturbance with planting, but you know, it's a really valid route. So I would say consider both and try and make the right choice for the site that you're considering. We also have many conversations about native or non-native. We support the planting of both. Again, pros and cons could go on for hours, and I won't. But native species will tend to support more native wildlife. But non-native species will still support some really good biodiversity as well. And I noted that Caroline put a link to a new report that's come out that COM4 have brought out about biodiversity in non-native woodlands or mixed woodlands as well. And I would recommend that people have a look at that. You can grow fantastic good quality from native hardwoods, but the squirrels are a major problem, and they are very hard to deal with. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of softwoods are grown, but that's also because they grow to a very consistent size and dimensions, and our sawmills are set up that way. So we need to consider the pragmatics of the, you know, pragmatic approach towards the forest industry that we have today, and, you know, look at how we work with that. So, you know, some really sort of important things to consider with pros and cons with native or non-native. And I'll happily talk about that more later, or we follow up with another one, but I think I better move on for now. We're not just talking about woodlands, of course. We, as the Forestry Commission, deal mainly with woodlands, and our grants will only be applicable really to woodlands or larger woodlands potentially. I'll go through some of the thresholds later, but it's really important that we also think about, you know, planting and managing better our hedgerows, our street trees, our orchards, our infield trees, trying to replace some of those. So I won't dwell on that any further. And we really have to maintain the trees that we plant, from when you first plant them, whether it's weeding around them, you know, making sure that they're protected in some way. You know, if you're planting on a small scale, making sure they're watered through periods of drought, and then going back through, removing tree guards. This image is of trees that haven't had their guards removed, and the number of guards I've removed from trees where that's happened, and it's really sad. Someone's gone to the trouble of planting it, and then they're just not looked after. And then as the trees get older, going back in and thinning, and being aware that those trees will need attention and care for decades. It's a real commitment. Understand your pests. Again, could talk for hours, and I won't, but do understand that a deer will decimate woodlands. If you have high deer pressure, and we have high and increasing deer populations, you really do need to take account of that. So either by putting guards on trees or by fencing areas. You know, it is really important to understand what the deer pressure might be in your area, and then to protect those trees before they before you put them in. And then as the trees get a bit older, then the grey squirrels do become a real issue, and a lot of people are finding that after sort of 20-25 years of a lovely broadleaf woodland, that suddenly they're getting really bad damage, and the squirrels will completely strip the bark from right round most of the species. So you do really need to consider you know, whether you're going to be able to control grey squirrels. We're not saying don't plant, but just please be aware that it can be a real issue, and it can really affect how you're going to manage that woodland. Most species, most native broadleaf species are susceptible to it. Ash, unfortunately, was one of the ones which was least susceptible and tended to get through and create a really nice timber tree or a big mature tree for conservation purposes, landscape purposes, whatever. cherry is a little bit more resistant to them than others, but it is a real issue that is it needs to be considered. Again, I'll move on from that rather than continuing. If you decide that you really would like to get the work done with a contractor, or if you're looking for tree nurseries, then I'd encourage you to have a look at the Woodland Directory, the Southwest Woodland Directory, and see if you can find somebody there. If you run a business relating to woodlands, I'd encourage you to list yourselves on it. It's free, and it's a really good way to connect up the woodland sector in our region. It sprang out of a paper directory, I think, originally, and then went online some years ago. I think it was a partnership with, certainly it used to be known as the COM4 Woodland Directory. COM4 used to host it, and it was a partnership, I think, between ourselves and COM4 and a number of other organisations in the Southwest. And then we sort of updated it 2 or 3 years ago, but we'd really like to encourage as many people as possible to make use of it. You just get a nice listing. It's quite simple, and it just, provides a way of trying to bring these businesses together. So moving on then to the Bright Tree. So I've just put this picture up really just to highlight. I think most people will know this, but different areas, there will be different woodlands and woodland types that will be typical in those areas. And so you may want to look at trying to reflect that, and certainly, trying to choose species that will do well in the soils that you have. There are lots and lots of different sources of information. I'll mention 1 or 2 others, but do have a look at your soils, do have a look at the trees that are growing around you locally, and do take advice on what to plant in the area that you want to plant up. If you're thinking about, a small woodland or something along those lines, do consider diversity. It's really important. Nationally, we have, I think, 5 conifer species that account for 80% of softwoods in our forests, and we are trying to diversify all the time and encourage others to diversify. And there are 5 broadleaf species that account for 72% of all hardwoods. Those, we really do want to try and increase the diversity. And the reason for that is both tree health and in terms of adapting to climate change, and also for wildlife as well. But so aiming for a wider range of tree species, wider genetic diversity within species, and much more structure within stands. So you've got different ages of trees as well within particular stands. So I just thought I'd share this woodland composition because it is for Devon. I thought it was quite interesting, and I'll just point at some of these because I know the colours may not always show up the same. So this one I think is oak. This one is ash. So this is something we really want to consider. This is just other broadleaves here. I think we've got Sitka spruce here, but you can see that we've got quite a mix within Devon and Somerset, but we want to try and achieve diversity wherever we can. I mentioned the tools for selecting species earlier on, and I thought I'd just use a bit of an example with a site that I helped to look after as a volunteer at home, which is just a small native broadleaf woodland that was planted about 25 years ago. So we have a model called a toolkit, if you like, called ESC4, the Ecological Site Classification Toolkit, which allows you to select the most appropriate species for a site, given its soil conditions, its exposure conditions, and it's really useful. It can be a little bit fiddly to just begin to get used to, but you put in your location and you can select different climate models. So you can look at the baseline, which is now, and which species, both commercial or non-native species might be suitable, and also which native broadleaves may be suitable. And it shows you, you can see the dark green is very suitable, light green, fine, the yellow is borderline, and we don't have, the yellow triangles are borderline, and we don't have any reds on that. And so at the moment, I might be looking at small leaf lime, wild service, oak and aspen in that particular woodland. When you then put on the sort of filter for a climate model of 2080, then you get a very different picture coming up, and certain species, you can see that they're beginning to look as if they might struggle. And so you begin to consider whether you might favour other species, introduce other species. In this particular location, it has some Scots pine already. It might be something where it might be worth considering having a few more of those. It has a lot of sycamore, which is already already there. So that's not a bad replacement for some of the ash that we're going to lose. So we'll probably accept some of the sycamore. The wild service may struggle, so we may encourage some of the hornbeam. So it just begins to get you thinking about how you might manage your woodland differently, and it certainly gets you thinking about how you might select your species differently when you start planting. So have a look at it and play around with it and see what you think. Then considering tree health, we've got a real increase in tree health. A real increase in tree diseases coming in, predominantly, partly due to climate change and the increase in sort of tree pests and diseases as a result of that. There is more sort of global transport of packaging and seedlings and things around. So there are issues there. We've got biosecurity procedures in place, and we've got an incredibly strong sort of tree health team who work for us nationally, but there are still worries and issues there. So do consider tree health when you're selecting your species as well. Obviously, at the moment, ash can't be planted. So talking about ash, it's the second commonest hedgerow tree in Devon. 12% of broadleaf cover in the UK. We are losing a huge amount of it. I'm sure you will have noticed this year that it's really hit quite hard. So yeah, I've just put follow the Devon 3-2-1 rule. There's a 3-2-1 sort of a phrase which you may have heard, which is if you're losing a large ash, replace it with 3 trees. As a medium one, replace it with 2, and a small ash, replace it with 1. And we have this project Saving Devon's Treescapes, which I think Heather's already mentioned. If you are considering replacing ash or planting because of the loss of ash, then you may actually want to be looking at several species, not just one. There isn't one that can completely replace ash. So have a look at the mixes. I think I'd better move on. Ellie, how much time have I got?
We have only actually got 3 minutes left. So I think we are going to overrun slightly. But if people do need to leave, then please feel free to kind of duck out as needed. I will send an email round with the recording from this, so if you do have to go, hopefully you can catch up on the final bit. I will also include links, and we will do any questions. We will type some responses, so we will get back to you even if it isn't during this.
Okay, I'll just go through the mapping quickly and then have a look at the grants in that case, okay. So in terms of the place, I would just say, if you're actually, if a scheme is coming to the Forestry Commission, these are the sorts of things that we check for. And I would encourage people who have smaller schemes to also look for these things. So you're looking to expand and link existing woodlands where you can, particularly existing ancient woodland, priority woodland habitat and other woodland, and look out and try to get to know about woodland priority species and plant to favour those where you can. And we have something called the Woodland Wildlife Toolkit that you can visit for that. Avoid planting on priority open habitat or important archaeological sites. I'll just say that if you want more advice on that, do please come to us. And buffer water wherever you can, check for flood risk, for water quality, etc. That's my, sorry. Very sorry, I had a timer on which I now can't turn off. There we go. Right. So I think most people would recognise the heathland of the New Forest as a priority habitat, but you might not recognise the field near where you live unless you happen to see it when the cowslips are out, etc. So try and get to know the areas that you're thinking of planting. Try and see them through, through a growing season to understand what their importance is, and obviously do your research. There's a lot of information out there. There's Natural England's Magic Map. There's the Devon County Council Local Environment Viewer, the Environment Agency's Working with Natural Processes Map, and the Forestry Commission Map Browser are all available. And on the map browser, you can look at the National Forest Inventory, the ancient woodland areas, the low-risk areas for woodland creation, so where planting large areas of woodland or productive woodland might be the most acceptable, and then also the stewardship layers of showing priority habitats, water quality, water flood risk, etc. Regulations and practicalities, just to highlight that we have UKFS, which I mentioned, which sets out good practice and the regulatory backdrop. Please be aware of that, and maybe have a look at it. All new woodlands should be planned according to UKFS design principles. We also have design techniques for forest management planning, which is well worth looking for. Be aware that if you're creating woodland, you should be getting an EIA opinion at least, and there are different thresholds. Probably most of you won't be wanting to plant anything on this scale, but do be aware that there is regulation around that. And then applying for grant, I will just go straight to the table of the key grants. I'm assuming that most people are more likely to be looking at the smaller plantings, and so I'll just quickly show you woodland creation under countryside stewardship. So if you're planting, there are two categories with biodiversity. The minimum threshold is 3 hectares with block sizes of 1/2 hectare. And that's a minimum of 80% native broadleaf species. But if you're planting in an area that's sensitive to water, then the area is just 1 hectare is the minimum area. And you can plant conifer or broadleaf in those areas, although by the edge, the riparian edge, it will be broadleaf. So minimum stocking densities are slightly different on those areas, but do talk to us if you're interested in that. If you're less than 1 hectare, then it's more likely you're going to be looking at the Woodland Trust grants or other ways of funding it. And you can also get capital payments for that. So since we're so short on time, I'll just highlight the fact that we have a grants overview, and I'll be happy to answer any questions if we've got time for questions at the end. I had a short case study, but I think we've got links to that which Eleanor can share. So I will finish there.
Thank you very much. That was really useful and informative. If people are happy to hang on, there are a number of questions that came up a couple of times. So if we tackle the kind of the primary ones, and then if there's any we don't get to in the next couple of minutes, then as I mentioned, I will send a follow-up email and I will pick Heather and Kate's kind of brains ahead of that to get you an answer. So one of the questions that came up, and I think you both touched upon it, but it would be great to discuss it in slightly more detail, was given climate change, should we also be considering kind of non-native tree species?
Shall I take that?
You start and then I'll add a few.
Yeah, I think we should, and we recommend that people do. We have a very sort of a restricted suite of native species, and they may well struggle in the future. So in the right circumstances, then I think we should definitely be looking at some of the species that certainly that may become the timber trees, but some of these are they're good for biodiversity as well. So just considering other species is really important. I think it's going to be something that we can't avoid, really.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. Of course it is, because obviously things are changing fast. I think from our perspective, I mean, certainly for an urban environment, for sure, yeah, there's certainly need for different species in urban environments, and for some productive forestry as well, especially if you're looking at, the yield obviously is really important. So you might definitely include other species. Obviously we're already planting non-natives for productive forestry anyway. But I think the point I was making earlier was more that when biodiversity is the key objective, or when we've got this sort of nature recovery network map, if you like, to really understand where our best spots are, and we're really trying to focus efforts on that network, so the woodland as part of an ecological network, we just mustn't underestimate the capacity of our native species to be resilient. So I totally hear the question is really important. I think Kate's example of that local reserve is important, because there's certainly some native species that will suffer more, but there will be others that will suffer a lot less. And actually there's a lot of, if we're allowing our native species to be resilient, because they're healthy woodlands and they're big enough, and we're allowing some natural regeneration so that the species are building that genetic diversity, they'll be stronger as well. So I'd agree with Kate that we need a diversity, and it's about the right species choices in the right place. So I'm definitely not saying no natives at all, definitely not saying that, but just being really careful that we're not that we're really responding to the ecological and climate emergencies together, if that makes sense.
Perfect. And moving on to new developments, there is a question around how important tree groupings and retaining existing hedges are than kind of new trees being planted as part of developments, tree-lined streets, etc.
I mean, I think they're really important, really important to try and retain as much of the sort of original vegetation, and particularly if you're talking about hedge lines, and particularly if you're talking about hedge lines that have the opportunity to connect through new developments. Not obviously bat flight routes is sort of the most obvious one, but they need to be not just sort of squeezed up and then sanitized, and not really to actually retain that original character. So where it's possible to keep kind of long hedge banks, or even sometimes where those sort of little lanes get kept as cycleways through and the hedges on either side are kept, they can be incredibly important for bats, butterflies, you know, and yeah, it's got to be better to retain wherever you can, hasn't it, than to plant fresh. Heather, have you got anything to add?
Absolutely agree with that. So trees take a few decades to establish, don't they? So if you've got a good hedgerow, please don't get rid of it. We need all the green infrastructure, to use that language that we already have in our urban environments. We need more. So let's protect better manage what we've already got as the first principle, and then expand that sensitively in the right way. But I think to the point around blocks versus lines versus, you know, your sole street tree, they're all important. They're definitely healthier when they're part of a community. So a street tree on its own on a smelly, polluted street will be much less healthy actually than a lot of others. But I mean, there's a huge amount in that arboricultural world. But protect first, I think, is the short answer. Don't have time to wait for the trees to grow.
I think we're going to have one final question, and then we will call it a day. But if anyone's got any other burning questions for either Kate or Heather, if you pop them in the chat, then we will get back to you at a later date. So the final one, it was touched upon a couple of times during the talk. But there has been quite a lot of kind of focus more recently on trying to move away from plastic tree guards, or alternatively towards kind of more sustainable ones. And I was just wondering whether you had any thoughts or kind of examples of good practice there that you could share.
Heather, did you? Oh, sorry.
I can start first. I think we'll both have things to say. I think the short answer is, I mean, none of us like planting all the, using all the plastic. It's clearly a problem. I know that in the past there's been a lot of plastic use. So I think the whole industry is definitely trying to be more mindful in reducing that use. Unfortunately, the short answer is that we can't just, it's not as simple as stopping using it, but because of the deer and squirrel damage in particular that Kate mentioned, we do need to protect the trees. So it's about finding alternatives. So alternatives might well be that, you might be able to fence something instead, and that's great where that works. It doesn't work everywhere. There are lots of biodegradable tree guards in development, there are lots of started to try and develop the right thing. It's not easy though, because if you imagine a standard compostable, biodegradable, nice, egg box type thing won't last more than a season, and that's not very useful for looking after a tree for sort of 10-15 years. So the challenge is finding something that will biodegrade but won't photodegrade into millions of different bits of plastic. That's the challenge. So the industry's working hard on it. I mean, we're trialing alternatives on various sites. So recent planting at Avon we reused a lot of previous tree guards where we could, but also we're trying to use all these alternatives. Short answer is there's no easy answer, but we know that it's a problem and the industry's working on it. Kate, you probably got more to add, and Caroline, you might as well.
Yeah, I was going to say I might pass over to Caroline. I'm afraid I haven't. I know that we've produced some guidance on it quite recently, but I don't think that's because there was anything groundbreaking that we could point people to and say this is going to solve all these problems. I think Heather, you've outlined it, really well. Fencing can be great, but it doesn't get over all the problems. I won't repeat everything Heather's just said. We don't have an ideal solution, but I will give Caroline a chance to speak because she may well have heard of something more cutting edge that's coming through.
I have just hopefully enabled Caroline to speak. So.
Hi, hello all. I've been interjecting via chat. I hope you haven't all minded. I'm the England manager and I lead our UK policy for the private sector essentially. So we represent everybody from the nurseries all the way through to store building. We're the NFU of the forestry world. We have various groups. One group newly established is the plastics group. We also have the forestry environment industry group. So looking at a UK level, working with plastic, so Tubex, Rainbow, the companies that produce the tubes, and looking at better ways to use them, looking at innovation, research, development, all of that, alongside, which is what we need, a very clear deer strategy for England and a grey squirrel strategy as well. They are the two elephants in the room that you cannot ignore. So Kate didn't mention earlier, shooting, of course, is a less palatable, but of course, and trapping. We have a whole suite of management tools that we need to use on both those threats as such. But if anybody wants to talk to me about private sector stuff, then you know, I'll maybe Eleanor could give my email out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I will. If you're happy with that, I can certainly share your contact details in the follow-up email. We're going to wrap it up there because I'm really sorry that we overran. It was always an ambitious amount of kind of information and content to try and squeeze into the hour slot. But hopefully you found that a kind of a useful starting point. It has signposted you to some places that you might go for kind of further information or various kind of grants and toolkits that are out there for you to kind of use. Yeah, if you have any further questions, then I will, you'll have my email addresses because I emailed you all this morning. But if you have any further questions, then let me know and I will hopefully get back to you. But thank you very much, Kate and Heather, for all of your kind of work in pulling this together and for a really kind of informative and useful talk. And thank you for coming. That was excellent.
Thanks very much.
Excellent presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sure. I was going to, mention just before you all, before you all run away. So I mentioned the Devon Nature Recovery Network currently in development. So unfortunately, it's not ready today. We're trying to work on some guidance that we can release ahead of planting season. So I think most of you will have found out about this through the LNP newsletter potentially. So watch that newsletter space for hopefully we'll have more guidance in the next coming weeks without over promising. But thank you all for coming today.